So now let's start to look at the factors which govern those degrees of biological adaptation. And the three key factors that we're interested in. And really these are the only three factors that govern biological adaptation, physiological responses to training. That is the intensity, that is how hard something is. The frequency, that is how often we train. And the duration, that is how long we train for. So let's start off by thinking about the intensity of training. So the intensity of training, interestingly, isn't quantitative, and we'll have to explain that in a moment. It is a qualitative component, and it's a function of the activities performed in a given unit of time. So why is intensity not quantifiable? Now that sounds really strange, because in exercise science we talk about training intensity all the time, and we might talk about training at a percentage of heart rate, or training at a percentage of VO2 max, or training at a particular race speed. But this is when it becomes really important to understand the terminology, but also to understand what we mean by intensity. When we're training, say, according to heart rate, we're fundamentally training based upon what that heart rate watch is telling us in terms of the cardiovascular response. But that cardiovascular response does not actually indicate for us what is happening metabolically, for example, in the skeletal muscle. So it doesn't tell us what's happening at a cellular level. So at no point does the heart rate truly reflect the overall intensity of training. Yes, I'm training at 75% maximum heart rate, but actually that doesn't reflect whether you've got muscles that are working beyond what let's call their critical power. So if you imagine we all have a critical power, that is a workload beyond which, if I go beyond my critical power, critical speed, I hit VO2 max, and below that, or at that point, I'm at a sustainable speed or a sustainable workload. Well, that's absolutely the case. But to understand that we all have a critical power or critical speed, we have to recognise that different biological systems, some will be working above their own critical speed or critical power to maintain whole body critical power, and some will be working below their critical power. And so that's why intensity is not quantifiable. Because when we take our measurements of intensity, we are assuming that we're taking a measure of intensity in, say, speed or heart rate or blood lactate or whatever it is we're using, and we're using it as a proxy indicator of whole body stress or whole body load that's being applied. But I need to understand that is not the case. And so we have to define intensity being more qualitative than it is quantitative. But that notwithstanding, what we understand, it is the major parameter influencing the effects of training, not just on the cardiorespiratory systems I've put here, but on all biological systems, whether that be for strength, whether that be for power. We understand that intensity is the most important parameter in terms of biological adaptation, far more important, as you'll start to understand, than either the duration or the frequency at which we train at. But we also understand that a large volume, and what I mean by that is doing lots and lots of high intensity training, is actually really poorly tolerated. That athletes don't respond. And if you think back to that schematic we started this session with, where we said that fatigue has both a positive and negative influence, this is where it can potentially have a negative influence. Is that if we expose the individual to too much training that's of high intensity, we are likely to trigger conditions that you may have heard of called overtraining. Actually, we now actually use the lexicon of the taxonomy, which is underperformance syndrome. In other words, it becomes detrimental to the health of the athlete. So let's have a look at this in context. So this is from a meta-analysis published in 2007. And what we've got here is got an increase in cross-sectional area per day as a percentage. Excuse me. And we've got the intensity here represented as a percentage of the 1 rep max. And what we can see is that when we have a low percentage of the 1 rep max, we don't really get much gain cross-sectional areally. There's a little outlier here, but generally we don't get much gain. But what you'll start to notice is, as the intensity starts to increase, there is variability, because each one of these represents a study, but there is generally kind of a greater conglomeration of our data points at a higher percentage per day in cross-sectional area than there is in a lower percentage per day. So in other words, as we move up the intensity scale, it starts to increase. But notice it also starts to fall off as we move beyond about 80% of the 1 rep max. So it's telling us that intensity is quite subtle. It's not just about high intensity produces big adaptation. It's actually understanding there is a sweet spot, seems to be here in terms of cross-sectional area, in terms of intensity. If it's too low, we don't really get much of an adaptation. And what you start to get is, as the intensity increases, the adaptation increases if you follow the tracer. You get to about 80%, and then it starts to drop off. So you get this kind of slightly skewed distribution curve, but it means that there is no justification in doing really high intensity strength training to produce, in this case, gains in cross-sectional area, showing us how important intensity is to biological adaptation. Now, let's just reflect on that a little bit more. So this is a really famous study published by Dave Costill a while back now, back in '88. And what they've done is they've looked at the effects of repeated days of intensified training on, in this case, on muscle glycogen and swimming performance. And what you've got here is our muscle glycogen before and after training period. And it's 10 days of intense training. Don't worry about which group you're looking at, but notice that what they've shown is this. Here's the kind of the pre to post, but you can see in this group here, this is the group that were allowed to maintain carbohydrate content. So remember that we said diet was important. So when diet was controlled here, there was no change. They were just able to maintain it. The muscle glycogen content. But in this group here, who basically only were consuming the same amount of carbohydrate that they through the 10 days of intense training that they were consuming before they went to that intense period of training, their muscle glycogen content has fallen. It's become detrimental. So it shows again, fundamentally, that intensity drives biological adaptation. In this case, it becomes a negative adaptation. In fact, there's no change here when they're doing intense training on muscle glycogen, and here it's detrimental because it shows the interaction between the intensity of training, in this case the diet of the individual. And if we then delve into their data a little bit more, it's a little bit complex in terms of what they've got going on here, but what they've got is submaximal data and maximal swim data, and we've got them here at pre, then day 5 and day 11. But if you look, for example, in their maximal swim data, you'll see, actually in terms of the times, despite the fact that muscle glycogen content has gone down, their maximal swim data, it's only 400 meter swim, didn't really decrease enormously. But look at the heart rate. They're actually producing this on a lower heart rate. Now, you might view that as being a positive. You go, well, they've got a lower heart rate for the same swim speed, but that may be a confounding variable, particularly when we move into later sessions within this course, where you start to look at underperformance syndrome. And perhaps you may want to make a note of that and come back to it, because that actually is almost certainly an indication of underperformance syndrome. But look at the blood lactate response. The blood lactate response submaximally, you'd go, well, that's a positive. Look, they're producing less lactate for the same swimming time or the same kind of swimming speed. Again, you may view that as a positive. So although the glycogen content is falling, they seem to be actually seeing some kind of biological adaptation. Again, you may want to look at that in the context of subsequent sessions when we get to underperformance syndrome. So it certainly shows, though, that intensity has a significant part to play here in biological adaptation.